So, John Blake, welcome to this session. On behalf of St. Francis Xavier Parish, on the participants in our great summer read, and the social justice, the racial justice group, really, that has been sponsoring this read. We're thrilled that you're going to have a little time to talk about the book and your approach to the book and experiences you had while writing the book. And I just want to assure you, so many of us, I personally enjoyed the book, and so many have come up and talked about it. We found it moving and reflective and really honest and very insightful and very helpful to us as we continue our work to promote racial justice. So
thank you.
Happy to have you here. My first question really comes from, I explained to you my background, my experience as an English professor. And I always, when I'm reading something that is nonfiction, that sometimes could be called creative nonfiction or other genres, certainly the booksellers list the book as either a memoir or an autobiography. But I found that it's really a mix of things. Because it's certainly your investigation of your family, particularly the white side of your family, but it's also your own personal story, and it's a reflection on the nature of racism, and comes to some thinking about what might be some remedies or ways forward. So my first question is, what story did you initially set out to tell, and did it become something else in the writing of it?
Well, that's a good question. And the story I originally set out to tell was more of a coming of age story, just a kid trying to solve a mystery. And the mystery was my mom disappeared from my life not long after I was born without any kind of explanation. Her family wanted nothing to do with me because my father's black and they're white. So I originally wanted to figure out, like, why she disappeared. Why did her family hate black people so much? And yet, why did she defy them and her community to be with a black man and have two children and risk so much in doing so? So it started off as that. But then to me, all the best stories evolve. To me, it's almost like, I don't know if you can relate to this with your background, but a story is almost like a person. We prejudge them, but we should always be open to surprises. And the story changed and it grew more layers as I began to tell it. And it became kind of like this spiritual conversion story, became a detective story, became a supernatural thriller.
Right.
Uh, it became a reflection on racism. But at the bottom, it's like a dedication to my mom and how I saw her one way at the very beginning, and at the end I saw her completely different. So yes, it's a blending of genres, but at its heart, it's me, kind of like showing a sort of an appreciation for my mom and her courage.
Great, great. And so, as you said, part of it was this investigation on the part of a kid growing up, but also as a journalist. I mean, you do talk about the incidents in 2015 that, really got you, sort of seriously thinking about writing this. Did it change? Has it changed your role as a journalist, your way of thinking about being a journalist?
That's an excellent question because it did. And I've talked a lot about that with my colleagues and my friends. It humbled me as a journalist because before I wrote the book, I assumed, like a lot of journalists, that facts change people. That if we just give people the information, if we just show them the videos of people like George Floyd dying, if we tell them read How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, uh, and if we just give them the information, people will change. There'll be enough white Americans who will accept and see that racism as it's more than just a problem. It's an existential threat to our democracy. But after writing this story, and I paid attention to what changed the members of my family, like the white members of my family, who frankly struggled with racism and were in denial about their racism. And what I noticed is that none of all the fancy books I knew, all the great arguments, all the videos I could have shown them, none of that changed them. It was the relationship that we experienced day in and day out over time. That was the critical factor. And so as a journalist, I'm realizing now that there are limitations to what I can do when I tell her story, that what's more important is that people belong in these relationships and they belong in these communities where people who are different are forced and challenged to get to know one another. And that's why, if there's any kind of theme to my book, one of the things I keep on saying is that facts don't change people, relationships do. And that comes out of my own experience in my family.
That's great. And your answer has anticipated some of my other questions.
Uh,
I should say to the audience, I did send these questions ahead of time, so John would have some time to reflect on them. So no big surprises then. So this actually leads into my next question, which, is central to the journey in your book, that you talk about is sort of coming out as a biracial man, right? Was the quest to learn more about your mother and your white family members. But as I was reading the book, I was thinking it was also really about your reflecting on and understanding more deeply your Black family members, and that the kind of the combination of the two really helped you, both in your own personal journey, but also in your understanding of racism and some of the things you write about racism. I was wondering if you could talk about how the exploration on both sides really helped you get to some of these ideas and conclusions.
yeah, because that's another good question, because as much of a mystery as my mother was, my father was an equal mystery, because he literally took his life in his hands to date my mom in the mid 60s. And I could never understand growing up, why would you risk so much? And so I wanted to understand him. And I think one of the things I came away from understanding him and my mom better is that to understand the choices that they made, I would have to understand the time in which they lived. And so they met during the mid 60s in the United States. And there was tremendous optimism in this country that things were going to change for the better. You had the passage of those three huge civil rights bills around the mid 60s, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Bill, and then the Fair Housing Act. But there was this feeling in the air that our best days are ahead of us, that yes, we have a problem with racism, but we can do better. And that helped me understand my father and his optimism, and my mom. And sadly, that made me reflect differently on the era in which we live in now. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is that as a journalist, I have seen so many stories about race that are just full of pessimism and fatalism. There seems to be this growing belief that we will never get past the racism in our country, that racism is a permanent part of America. And I think part of that is, as journalists, the only stories we tell tend to be stories of failure, pessimism. We don't write about the victories. We only write about the problems. And so I'm like, wow, I have this story in my own life that represents a victory. And we need more stories like that, because I think the kind of optimism my parents had in a different time is necessary for us to deal with the problems we face today.
Great. Um, as I was reading the book, now this is totally coming from my own perspective, I was reminded of the Confessions of St. Augustine, which I don't know if you've read or
Oh,
not.
I've read it. I mean,
Oh,
golly,
yeah.
I should write that down. I would compare it to the
Right.
Confessions of Saint.
Well, and it's in this way. So I
Okay.
thought this is on one of the many levels of your narrative. It's the story of a soul. It's a story of your own soul coming into your adulthood. And I thought of it from the perspective of Ignatian spirituality, which is the spirituality of the Jesuits. Saint Ignatius of Loyola, uh, very much his charism was about finding God in all things, but most importantly, he wrote these spiritual exercises, which were kind of a retreat journey for people to attend to their interior life and do what he calls the discernment of spirits, that our feelings, our thoughts, the ways our heart moves, these are all ways we can judge, what's coming from God and what's coming from whatever the evil spirit is, that what are the movements or the voices inside that we should listen to that will bring us to greater flourishing and peace and love, or what take us away towards doubt, towards despair, and so forth. And as I was reading your book, there are a number of really intense moments you record where you're experiencing things like shame or
Yeah.
guilt, anger, of course, fear. One of the moments I thought was really telling was when you describe your compulsion to extract an apology from your white aunt. And I
Yes.
thought this is a really key moment. But on the other side, you also described very articulately your desires for connection, for understanding, for compassion on both sides of the family, for forgiveness, obviously, and reconciliation. And I think it's all about a movement toward love. And so I was wondering, and I'm throwing a lot of sort of
Yeah.
stuff on the top of this, but if you think about your experience interiorly as you were making these discoveries and moving toward an appreciation not only of the two sides of your family, but your own life and your own racism. I mean, the moment where you said, that your aunt, what was in her was also in me, I thought
Oh
was
yeah.
another powerful moment. Could you
Yeah.
talk about how those inner movements kind of help you to understand racism more clearly in your own personal life, and then, of course, in some of the ways you've been talking about? Long
Well, I'm glad you raised that crucial scene where I said that what was in my aunt Mary, was also in me, because I don't think I could have written that maybe 5 years ago. I don't think I could have written that. I think I've only could have written that as a man who is almost 60 years old, who has lived a lot, who has felt shame, who has failed, who has experienced grace, and know how powerful that is. And I think that spiritual movement you're talking about, so much of that revolves around grace. And if I can make sure I understand your question, I feel like the biggest struggles in the book were the internal struggles that I had. And I
term.
felt like if I was going to have any credibility with the reader, to say that I built these bridges with these people who wanted nothing to do with me, who I felt hated me because I was Black, I had to be very open about my anger, about the guilt, and I had to be very open about the times where I caught myself being a hypocrite. And so I just felt like I had to show that kind of inner movement to give myself credibility to the reader. But I mean, all that was kind of unplanned. I mean, I could just say I planned all this, you
Oh,
know,
no, 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 I understand.
but it's in the telling of the story. There's
I,
so much that happened that it went in directions that I didn't expect. I mean, really, if you look at my story, there was so much that happened to me that was beyond my control. I couldn't have predicted that white man and that Black man would come up to me when I was in college at precisely the time I needed to hear a message of racial healing and say, brother, there's another way to live besides this anger you're being consumed with. I mean, a lot of those to me are movements of God. Like, I have struggled to figure out, is my book a book about race, or is
mhm.
it about faith? And I think so much of it is about faith, because there are things that are beyond my control where God is moving in my life and presenting these choices to me that I have to make.
And when you said grace, I said Saint Ignatius would have lit up
Oh,
because
okay.
it's about both. I mean, in Ignatian spirituality, we don't separate sort of the material from the spiritual. It's God is experienced through the world, through our experience, through our emotions, and so forth. And so when you talked about these are movements of God, that's exactly what Saint Ignatius is talking about when we sort of discern and those things, and I saw your story as kind of moving forward, and you hit a couple of dead ends, and you also hit some places where you were kind of paralyzed, but
Mhm.
understandably, because you didn't understand everything that was going on, and then you encountered things in you that it took a while to name, right?
Mhm.
And but I think this is a perfect segue into the next question, because to speak more specifically about faith and your journey to faith that involved at times like Bible study, and of course your experience of different types of churches and church going. I'm wondering, to talk a little bit more specifically about that faith journey, what sort of helped you and supported you? And obviously it was all within Christianity, but what helped and supported you in it? What sometimes were obstacles to your sort of moving forward? And kind of where are you? How was your faith grown or changed in the course of it?
Well, faith was indispensable. I would not have been able to appreciate and understand my mom, reconnect with my mother's sister, and on a kind of strange level, reconnect with my mother's father if it wasn't for faith. And specifically, it's because when I had to try to make these connections with these people I felt this tremendous anger with, the fact that they were also Christians meant that we had this kind of common language. Concepts like forgiveness, we talked about grace, that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We all spoke that language. So that kind of became this meeting place for us to kind of work out our differences. But I think more importantly, particularly as a young man, when I had this tremendous anger toward white people, and I thought that just white people would never understand what it meant to be Black and to be poor and to grow up in a neighborhood like I did, to feel the type of rejection I felt. When I went to those interracial churches that I attended, and when I saw white, Black, and brown people hug one another, become brother and sister, become friends, that was just as crucial as seeing my mother's sister change. So it just it ceased being something I read about and great ideas you read about in the Bible, but going to church and being part of that community and developing those friendships, that made it all concrete. That made it all possible. That made me imagine that maybe I can connect with them. Maybe I can get past this. So it was indispensable. I don't think I could have done it without faith, and I don't think we could have connected. And that's one of the things I try to tell people. I think is really important about churches. Church is one of those few communal places we have left in this country that's designed to attract people from different backgrounds and different races. And we need places like that more than ever if we're going to get past these differences.
This question is definitely coming from me, but I think it's coming from the group, which would be Catholic readers. Just some curiosity about what you might have learned. You mentioned your mother was Catholic. She would ask for a St. Jude prayer book, the patron of the hopeless cases, right? Were there other things you learned about Catholicism? I think we're just really curious about that exposure to that on your mother's side.
I have to admit, I can't say that I learned anything deeper about Catholicism through my mom. I tell you, the thing that I have learned a lot about Catholicism, one is I'm a student of the Civil Rights Movement. And I know how crucial the Catholic Church role played in the Civil Rights Movement. And just traditionally, there stands for social justice. And one of my favorite theologians and one of the most formative books for me is a book written by a Catholic theologian named Hans Kung, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Hans Kung, yes, Hans Kung.
Yeah, he wrote a book on being a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read that book probably about 3 or 4 times, and it really changed the way I look at my faith. But as far as through my mom, her Catholicism, it was, it kind of reminded me a lot of the Black church and the way we see Christianity, where God is that refuge when you have nowhere else to turn, when everyone looks down on you. I saw similarities in the Black church that I grew up in.
That's great. So now we're going to shift a bit to sort of the more theoretical reflections that take place in the book tied to racism. But I do have something. I'll follow up with something connected to Christianity after we talk about this question.
Okay.
So you draw from contact theory to explain how people change their attitudes towards race. You propose radical integration as a model for moving forward. From my background in higher education, my last job, I worked across the Jesuit colleges and universities, and I had 2 experiences. One was working with a lot of DEI officers, who would be coming from a perspective of critical race theory and some of the stronger theories about white supremacy and white privilege and trying to dismantle systemic racism. But I also worked for the first couple of years. I worked with some of the Jesuits who were working with the descendants of the Georgetown University 272 enslaved persons. And you've probably read recently, we just announced more money that's going into a foundation network for, to try to care for the descendants. So this question is really, how do you sort of see yourself and answer those people who might say, well, you're making it so personal and it's all about personal contact, and yet we have these systems that are, racist, and we have it's all skewed towards whites. What's your answer to them, and what kinds of kind of debates have you had with them?
Yeah, I use this word integration, as you mentioned, radical integration, and that's probably one of the uncoolest words you can use when you talk about race now, because it's like so thoroughly discredited. But to answer your question, to me, when I talk about integration and other people talk about systemic racism and we have to deal with white supremacy and structural racism, the two are linked. To me, it's a misunderstanding of integration to believe that it's only confined to the personal. When Dr. King and the people talked about integration, talked about sharing space, but also sharing power. It's a misunderstanding. Integration is also, it's not just about let's be buddies with white people. It's also about we should be able to live in the same neighborhoods anyone else should be able to live in. We should be able to vote like anyone else. We shouldn't go to jail at a higher rate of being on death row more so than any others. That's one of the things that surprised me as I wrote this book and I began to really read about integration. I read King, like essays like The Ethical Demands for Integration. I thought before that it was just about us sitting next, being friendly with white folks. I didn't know that they also meant power. So I would say to those people who say the two aren't, one, that you choose one or the other, I'm saying, no, it's both. You have to do both. You have to go after the systemic stuff. You have to go after the structural stuff, but you also have to go at the personal stuff. And I think one of the things that contact theory shows, you can pass all the laws. You can show people all the George Floyd videos, but that doesn't decisively change racial attitudes. And we saw that in the George Floyd protests. I know things have returned to the status quo in part because of this well orchestrated backlash. But a lot of it's also the reason it's returned to the backlash is because we still live in pretty much segregated worlds in this country. So I think that if you have to change people, you have to create relationships. You have to create those communities. Otherwise, you can do the structural stuff and you could do the systemic stuff, but a lot of times those changes won't last unless people's attitudes also change. So I think they both work together. There's not a contradiction. And I think, frankly, what's happened over the past couple of years, a lot of people have relied too much on their belief that if we just show them enough videos, if we just
Right.
show them enough books, that will change people. And it's not enough.
And this is where I want to come back to Christianity, because in some of the discussions I would have with these, diversity officers, really
Mhm.
well intentioned, really doing great work. But I would say, we, at least at Jesuit schools and in Christian institutions, we have a narrative that helps us with this, because it's a narrative about people's hearts changing. It's a narrative
Yes.
about everyone recognizing that we're loved sinners, and we have Jesus Christ walking his path to show us how to be human, and to
Mhm.
try to reconcile us and redeem us. And I always felt like we don't lean into that narrative. Those of us who are Christian, we don't lean into that narrative, and the ways in which, and I directly connect with your own narrative. I'm thinking of the song Amazing Grace, the ways in which each of us as individuals ideally comes to a point where we recognize our limitations, our weakness, our racism, and place ourselves in the hands of God and ask for our hearts to be turned away from hearts of stone. And I think that a lot of that happens in your narrative, that your heart is softened because of what you encounter, while you're also very, very honest about the horrors of it, and the
Yeah.
equities and the injustices and so forth. So I always feel like we as Christian churches could do a lot better job of trying to link these together, and reach out to people to say, sure, there's all kinds of theoretical stuff going on here, and it's all about power systems, but at the level of individuals, it's about changing your heart, and the contact that you describe is a way to do that, I think.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question. Why don't you think Christians lean into that narrative?
Oh boy, that's a good question. Um, I think for some it's just too intimidating because it requires looking within first. I mean,
Mhm,
really, you getting in touch with your own racism really
mhm,
helps you understand the other side and to think of a way forward and to be willing to do that. It's that softening of heart. A lot of people don't want to look inside and they don't realize that my favorite line from the prophets is God saying, what I want is mercy, not sacrifice.
mhm.
Just as we receive mercy, that's what we're supposed to be giving to others. So I think a lot of us don't really want to go there, sadly. um,
I
but
agree
to see
with you,
that
and I
it's
wanna
free, you know
excuse me?
to see that it's freeing and transformative. uh,
Yeah, I agree with you, and I wanna pick up on that. I think in some ways, one of the reasons in the past years we've leaned so much on, showing people the videos, like read this book and this will liberate you. Put that Black Lives Matter sign on your lawn, go to that protest, that will do it. Because in some ways that's easier than getting to know someone who is different, who sees the world differently, who expose maybe your hypocrisy, maybe your anger, maybe your racism or intolerance. That's much more difficult. That's why people who think of integration as something that's naive and weak have no idea. It's extremely difficult, because it's not just in the head, you involve your heart. But that is the thing that really changes people. Like I said, it's both. It's not do it in place of systemic racism. I say
right
no.
now,
This is indispensable. You need both, and I think we've forgotten that you need both.
St. Ignatius Loyola in the spiritual exercises at one point, and he's talking about the last week of the exercises about love. And he says, love is shown more in deeds than in words. And if it
Yeah.
doesn't come down to deeds of peace and love and reconciliation, you haven't gotten the message, right?
Yeah.
I have one more question. I want to make sure we get it in. So you talked about a lot about your experience of these different churches, and I would say, and I gave you this information, that St. Francis Xavier Parish is probably more like the sort of racially mixed parish that you experienced in college, uh, rather than I wouldn't say we're racially integrated. We're about three-quarters white, and we're 25% people of color. We have a lot of very progressive Catholics, progressive people who are very concerned about racial justice, and we've had different efforts at it. Um, we have a racial justice pledge that we say at Mass. We have a Black Lives Matter poster on our front gate. Uh, but my question to you is, could you talk more about what you think is effective in in a parish setting to kind of move things forward with regard to race relations and moving towards more equity? And it's basically what advice do you have to the parish about trying to be more racially integrated than just racially mixed? What's effective? What do you recommend?
Yeah. One of the things I've learned from attending a multiracial churches, and one that really did it well, so well that it got national recognition, is that pay attention to who's in the pulpit, or like the leadership. If everybody in the pews if the pews are racially mixed, but if you look at the leadership, they're all white men, that's a problem. But also changes in worship, music, all those things. Look at that and how that can make different groups feel welcome. And I know when you start talking about those things, that often creates tremendous conflict. But if you're going to make people feel welcome, if it's going to be really integrated, I think you need that. And two, I understand that conflict is part of it. Like just because I've attended multiracial churches where people didn't really talk about race or class or anything like that, and they thought they were healthy because of it. In fact, they were unhealthy. In the church, the most healthiest church I went to, we had tremendous conflict. We debated and argued all the time, but that was healthy. That was necessary. That's inevitable when you're trying to bring different groups of people together. And all you have to do is look at the book of Acts, right? New Testament. It's one argument over another, So those are the things that I would share that have been really helpful to me.
Great.
Just a final thing. I mean, not to ramble too much, but I think this country needs the church's example more than ever. I mean, we have a great model. You used the word narrative before. We have a great story. And I know a lot of that story is cruelty, hypocrisy, but a lot of it is we have this history going back to the Bible of different groups, different people working out their differences and coming together. And we need those type of stories more than ever. And that's part of the reason I wanted to tell my story, because I think it's that kind of story.
Well, John, thank you so much for all of your answers to these questions and helping open up the book to us even more. I know they're going to be really helpful for our discussions. And I hope if we'd had more time, I would have asked about how the book's being received. But I hope that you're getting the kind of response that I'm seeing among our readers. And we're really grateful for your story. And we wish you well as you move forward with whatever your next projects are. And we love the fact that you've made such a great contribution to this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Okay, thanks.